Hey guys, how you going? Hope you're all doing very well. This evening I'm going to be doing another movie review. This movie is a drama slash fantasy movie from Australia, English language, released in the year 2019, directed by Mira Folks, and this film is called Judy and Punch. So Judy and Punch is set in this medieval sort of town called Seaside. Now Seaside is a very strange place, and the most famous people there are Judy and Punch. And so they're a couple and they're puppeteers. And so they mesmerise audiences all the time with their puppeteering abilities. But what this public don't know is that Punch is actually quite violent, and there's a lot of domestic violence because he takes out a lot of anger on his wife and whenever he starts to drink. And so one day when Judy goes out, she tells Punch to look after the baby. There's a tragedy that occurs that causes Judy to lose her mind, and Punch, he basically physically assaults her to the point where he thinks now Judy's dead. But Judy is not dead, and now she's going to come back for her vengeance. And so whether or not that is the case is something you're going to have to find out for yourself, because that's as far as I'm going with my synopsis. Now my thoughts on Judy and Punch. I was actually quite curious to see what this movie was all about. Now this is an Australian film, but it's an Australian film that is very, very strange. It's unlike any other Australian film recently that I've seen. So it does have English accents, and so it doesn't have the typical Australiana, which I thought it just added to the quirky sort of world that this movie was set in. It was set in the medieval type of period, and I thought it was just very quirky. The characters were very much out of this world. It almost felt like I was watching another dimension, and so that's something I liked. I thought that it was very different. I thought this script was actually larger than life, and the larger than life caricature nature actually matched the caricature nature of the puppeteers. So it was almost like you were watching a puppet show as a viewer, and so what was going on, I just thought it was colourful, and that's exactly what you want from a movie, especially Australian films, where Australian films they lack a lot of creativity, whereas this movie does have that sense of creativity, and it has the sense of social commentary about domestic violence and how violence can be very devastating, and how the public can be hidden from that violence. And so Judy and Punch appear to be these very successful duo, but behind closed doors it's definitely a different story. So the movie does have a touch on domestic violence and a commentary on domestic violence to some point. I thought Mia Wasikowska, who played Judy, was fantastic. She was the main character, and I thought that the rest of the acting ensemble did a great job. As I said, it's a very quirky style of script, and the quirkiness is matched with the characterisation, and I thought that everybody in this film has a lot of fun. But it's a very, very dark film. The tone is very dark. On the outside you've got a silly type of film, but on the inside you've got a very dark underbelly, and that darkness is very nasty, and it makes you feel very uncomfortable, because the lightness on the outside doesn't match the darkness on the inside, which once again symbolises domestic violence. Is on the outside it all looks happy and fluffy, but on the inside, behind closed doors, it's not quite that. So it's a very contrasting difference, and I think that Mira Folks does a good job at actually creating that distance and creating that contrasting differences in worlds. And so I thought that was very riveting. And so it's a movie that does go down some pretty nasty places without having to go to very graphic nature of violence, and so it's not shocking you for the sake of shocking you with very cheap tricks. It's shocking you through the characterisation and what's actually going on, and so it doesn't try too hard. Therefore it comes across naturally, and it's going to shock you a lot more than it would if it was just splashing it for silly juvenile reasons, as to just get a shock for the sake of it, like cattle prod shocks, in that you're being jabbed with a shock and you're jumping, but you're not really jumping for the right reasons. You're just shocked, and that's what jump scares are all about. Whereas jump scares, if you're talking about horror, a jump scare is different from a proper scare. And so I thought this movie gives you the proper sense of dread, the proper sense of shock, as opposed to just prodding you with that cattle prod. And so I thought all that was actually quite decent. So cinematography is excellent, as I said, very vibrant colouring. So as far as an Australian film is concerned, this is really top notch as far as creating something that is so much different from a typical made-for-television film. But my problem with Judy and Punch was that, yes, it is a very dark film, and it's a movie that I think is important, and it's a movie that is very quirky, which is everything I liked, but unfortunately there was just something missing towards the end, in that it did shock me to start with. I was intrigued in the world that it created. I thought it did it brilliantly, but after a while it just starts to lose steam a little bit. It just can't quite get to the finish line to really nail it. And so I thought the first 3/4 of this movie were fantastic, but unfortunately the finish, I just couldn't invest as much time as I did for the rest of the movie. So I thought as though it runs out of steam, and thankfully it doesn't run out of steam, too early, because otherwise then it would have been a massive disappointment. But for me, it just prevents itself from being a brilliant film because of the fact I felt like it ran out of steam, and it just wasn't quite as hard hitting as it would have been, if it matched the first 3 quarters. And so I just thought it outstayed its welcome a little bit towards the end because the material was just starting to get exhausted. But thankfully it finishes before it derails it, which is something that I liked. Judy and Punch is definitely a cut above the normality as far as Australian cinema is concerned, so I definitely think you should go out there and see it. If you're a fan of Mia Wasikowska, then this is definitely one for you. It's a very a good performance, and it's a performance that, although it's a caricature nature that the world is set in, I thought her dilemmas are dilemmas that a lot of people in this world can relate to, especially if you yourself have gone through domestic violence and what she actually has to do in order to get out of this toxic environment that she's found herself in. So if it sounds like your kind of thing, definitely go out there and see it. It's not a bad film at all. I'm going to give this one 3.5 stars. Alright guys, that's it for my review. Hope you enjoyed it. Till next time, keep watching movies, and I'll see you later.